Okay, so today I want to continue our look at tables. This table here is not unlike the ones you've seen before, but there are two important differences. If you look here, Aston Villa now spreads across two columns. And this image here in Bolton Blackburn Rovers spans across two rows. So we'll see how that looks in the table now. We'll look in the code. So if you look here, we have our table as before, and then we have our row for Arsenal. Nothing strange or startling there. But in the row with Aston Villa in it, we have our TD for our image cell, which is fine. But then in the TD, the Aston Villa text, we're saying col span equals 2. And that causes this cell here to span across two columns. Exactly. So if you have a double class on your timetable table, you can use col span to span across. Now that would work if you have 9, 10, 11, 12, 1, 2, 3, 4 across the top and Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday down the side. But of course there's no class that spans across 9 o'clock on a Monday morning to 9 o'clock on a Tuesday morning. It doesn't span across 2 days, it can only span across 2 hours. So depending on how you've used your table, how you've designed your table, you may need to use col span, or you may need to use row span in order to do double classes. So let's have a look at the code here. In this case, we're saying row span equals 2 in the TD cell, which is the first cell in that row. So this image here this cell is going to span across two rows. You can see the effect of that. And what makes it a bit confusing is that in the subsequent row then that you spanned into, you're missing a cell. Because in this row you only have to account for 3. So you've got 1, 2, 3, 4 cells in this row, but in the TD for this row, in the TR for this row, there's only 3 TD cells. There's only 3 TD tags. So it spans across. So that's how you can make the cell break out of its walls and span across into another one. Now, the relative widths of the cells, the relative widths of the columns rather, and the relative heights of the rows is something that the browser decides. Now typically the browser decides this based on the relative widths of the longest lines. So if I put some junk in here, this will cause this particular column to become wider. That's more exaggerated with a smaller size. Okay? So this column now is much wider than the others because it has more contents in it. It's the browser that decides the widths of the columns. So although a given cell may have a col span of 2, for example, we're not saying anything about the actual size. We're just saying that it's broken across 2 columns or 2 rows. So it's a bit like you have a building with different apartments, okay? And let's say you knock one apartment, you knock the walls down between one apartment and the next. So now you've got like one apartment that's actually taking up two. It's got a span of two. Okay? Just because it's got a span of two, we're not saying it's necessarily bigger than all the other apartments in the building. I mean, there may be one in the penthouse that's huge. Okay? You're just saying that you're knocking a wall between the cells and you're spanning across two rows or two columns, or maybe 3 or 4 or 5 depending. But don't confuse the sizes that you see with the col span and row span. When you're doing col spans and row spans, you're not saying anything about the actual size. I mean, if you look at the gunners there, the gunners, rovers and trotters, I mean, those are very wide cells. They're not any wide, they're much wider than the Highbury Villa Park and Reebok Stadium and stuff. But the gunners, blah, 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 that's still only one cell. It happens to be bigger than the others, but it's still only one cell. It's still only one apartment. It's just a particularly big one. Where we have Aston Villa, we've knocked the wall between the two apartments. And obviously one of them was big to start with. But col span and row span are talking about the structure of the table. They're not saying anything about the actual size. Once the browser decides the size, typically what it does is it will look at the longest line in each row and do a proportional divvying up of the space that's available. Where there's an image, typically it expands so that the image can fit the size. So, for example, if I was to do this, if I change the size of that image, you can see the cell there has expanded to accommodate the image. So when you're doing col span and row span, the important part is you're not saying anything about the actual size. Don't be confused or misled by the actual sizes you're being presented with. What's important is the underlying structure of the table. Remember I was saying if you took a small image and made it really big, it would look crap? Well, there you go. Okay. So any questions on that? So what I'd like you to do now is I'd like you to modify the timetable that you made so that you can accommodate double classes. Depending on how you've done that, you'll be using either col span or row span, but you won't be using both because there's no class spans across 2 days. Wouldn't that be fun? Any questions? Yes, sir. Row span. So you put the row span inside in the TD. Let me just show you there. I'll just put it on this. I'll just show it on the screen again, just bigger this time, okay? Because there's one important point I want to make. Look, you say row span inside in the TD tag itself. So it's open bracket, TD, space, row span equals quote to quote. It goes in there. It's inside in the TD tag. It's an attribute of the TD tag. Make sure you don't say something like open bracket TD close bracket row span equals 2. Okay. So I'll be using row span or col span depending on the situation. For your timetable table, you won't be using both col span and row span, just be one or the other. So if you have Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Fridays across the top of your table, then to do a 2-hour class, you're going to have 9, 10, 11, 12 down the side. So if you're spanning down the side, you're going to have a row span. If you've got Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday down the side, and you've got 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15 across the top, then you're going to be talking about using col span. Questions? So that shouldn't take you long. Now the tricky thing is that if you do a row span, the cell underneath, the row underneath where you do the row span is going to have fewer cells. So if you have your programming going from this cell to this cell, you have to remove the programming that was in the row underneath, or they won't all add up, and things will get squished and stuff and be a big mess. However, if you're only using col spans, that's not such a big deal. You just have to make sure they all add up in each row.